We are going to start, so I ask all the speakers to come to the desk. I think we can start. So thank you for being here. Thank you for the people following us at distance as the event is on streaming. I am Edoardo Croci, professor at Bocconi University, Milan. Bocconi is organizing this event in conjunction with cambiaMO, and I will give the floor very soon to Gianni Rondinella from cambiaMO to introduce cambiaMO. And we have a wonderful panel of speakers here with us. They will speak in this order. Serin Kakentantom, sorry for the pronunciation, Program Manager and Officer, City Resilience Global Program, UN Habitat. Tadashi Matsumoto, Head of Unit Sustainable Development and Global Relations, OECD. Benedetta Lucchitta, Researcher of the Sustainable Urban Regeneration Lab, Bocconi University. Paolo Bertoldi, Senior Expert, JRC, European Commission. Ndivile Mokoen, Project Coordinator Gender, Climate, Southern Africa. Federica Ranghieri, Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist in South Asia region of the World Bank, but I think this is her old title and now she has a new one, she will say, because she's now living in Egypt. And finally, Aline Cardoso, representative of Municipal Secretary for Economic Development and Labor, City of São Paulo. The topic of our official side event here at COP27 is the contribution of urban regeneration to climate neutrality in cities. This topic really links the relevance of cities and in particular urban regeneration to carbon neutrality. I have a very short presentation, but before giving my short presentation, I leave the word to Gianni Rondinella to introduce cambiaMO, who co-organizes the event. I also want to thank UN Habitat, who also is collaborating in the organization of the event, and of course, all the organizations which are present here with their speakers. Gianni?
Good morning to all. Thank you for coming. Also from my organization, which co-organized this side event with the Sur Lab of Bocconi University. I'm Gianni Rondinella, co-director together with Floridea Diciommo, cambiaMO Changing Mobility, a non-profit organization based in Madrid, Spain, researching, practicing and innovating in the mobility sector and climate change, pushing the agenda forward in the nexus between the technical system, the urban technical system, and equity, social inclusion, gender, and climate justice. Therefore, we bring to this table the consideration of social inclusion, intersectionality, and gender equality dimensions into the urban regeneration process. And why? Because it's at the local level of city, regions, and communities that implementation of climate change policies has to start. Because being gender responsive will enhance the effectiveness, inclusiveness, and acceptance of local mitigation and adaptation policies, and because it is addressing the root causes of situation of vulnerability of people, that cities' climate policies and initiatives can be transformative and regenerate the urban settlements. So our key priorities in this matter are, firstly, to apply always an intersectional and balanced perspective in urban regeneration when mentioning stakeholders. Means to include the children, youth and elders, women and girls, people with disabilities and indigenous people, people left behind and people alone. And secondly, under implementation of urban regeneration, we need to underline the collection of guidelines and best practice for urban gender transformative climate action. So thank you for, I will present afterward Ndivile, but I leave the floor to Edoardo to give the floor to the next speaker.
I will go to the podium for a very brief introduction, and then each speaker will have, let's say, 8 minutes in order to keep the time and maybe have the time for a few questions at the end. So a very brief introduction of the topic, then we'll pass from a more general framework to some specific cases and application in the global south of the relationship between urban policies, urban regeneration in particular, and carbon neutrality. Just to start with my introduction, we know that cities' carbon footprint can be very different depending on regions and cities. This is a survey, an analysis on 13,000 cities on 187 countries, which shows the relationship between total carbon footprint, meaning including life cycle emissions and population. As you can see, there are very different levels, and even if we consider per capita emissions, basically we go from 1 to over 25 tons per capita per year, which provides a very wide framework of emissions. Also, cities have an opportunity to contribute to emission reductions, being responsible of a relevant share of emissions. Actually, you can see that buildings are the main areas where there is a potential of reduction, followed by transportation, and then by waste and materials. The difference between the full colored areas and the dot ones shows the contribution of decarbonization of electricity supply in dots. This means that thanks to decarbonization of electricity supply, the process can be much stronger and basically going almost to total decarbonization of cities over a period of from now to the middle of the century. In particular, in buildings, the role of decarbonization of electricity supply can be very relevant. As we said, cities can provide a relevant contribution, and more there are cities which commit through voluntary pledges to become carbon neutral. This sample is made of 241 cities with more than 500,000 inhabitants. It is part of a wider sample of over 1,000 cities which has been considered and which already pledged to become carbon neutral. On the left, basically you see the distribution of the full sample, which involves all continents. On the right, you can see the time horizon of the decarbonization process. It's interesting to note that most cities, over 3/4 of the cities, basically committed to year 2050 for decarbonization. So with quite a long-term horizon, probably too long. We need to accelerate the process of carbon neutrality even at city level. A certain number of cities committed to earlier decarbonization, in particular among the cities with a time horizon before 2030, there are many European cities, especially in northern countries. There will be also a presentation from Paolo Bertoldi from the European Commission, who will present some specific instruments which allow European cities to accelerate in this direction. When we speak about decarbonization, we have to immediately make clear which kind of emissions we consider. As you know, there are Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 are direct territorial emissions. Scope 2 include emissions from electricity, included in electricity. Scope 3 include all emissions included in consumption. Looking at this picture, including all three scopes, again, what we see is the very relevant role of buildings. More than 63% of emissions in this sample, which is the sample of C40 cities, is attributable to emissions in building. 28% to transportation and 9% to waste. So again, we understand how important it is to intervene on our buildings, on our built constructed assets for decarbonization. And it's interesting to note that in buildings in particular, it is residential and commercial buildings which are relevant, and differently from transportation and waste, in buildings the majority of emissions comes from Scope 2 emissions. This means that in buildings it is very relevant the use phase of buildings. So again, if we consider all scopes, we need a variety of policies which doesn't include just the construction phase, but more specifically the use phase of a building, and finally even the dismissal phase of a building. In this sense, urban regeneration can be sustainable and can provide a relevant contribution to decarbonization in cities. Regeneration entails different forms of spatial interventions, ranging from renewable to rehabilitation, which can change the form and the land use structure of cities. On the right, we can see some domains where urban regeneration can operate. The first one is land use. The change in land use can be very relevant to have a mix of uses is also relevant. Now there is the paradigm of 15-minute cities, which is well known and goes into that direction. Mobility and sustainable mobility also is a relevant domain of action, which is included to urban regeneration. We don't have to think only about the buildings, the physical infrastructures. We have to think what there is around the specific buildings and the system more in general. Clean energy, of course, with distributed energy, with smart grids, with new role of consumers can be relevant. Circularity is another relevant domain, looking at materials, at resources, at disposal. Resilience, more connected to adaptation, is another very relevant area linked to urban regeneration, especially linked to the recourse to nature-based solutions. Digitalization, also linked to dematerialization, is another interesting domain. And of course, finally, we have social and economic domains linked to inclusion and to a prosperous and vibrant economy, which should be considered. Also, the framework of the Agenda 2030 is a relevant framework in this sense. As you know, there is a specific goal, Goal 11, dedicated to cities, but more in general, urban regeneration is linked to several goals, in particular to Goal 1 regarding poverty and to Goal 6 regarding water use, but as you can see, all goals are connected to urban regeneration. Looking at the specific contribution of urban regeneration to decarbonization, there are several measures which can be relevant. Here we list the main ones: brownfield reclamation, building refurbishment, nature-based solution implementation, renewable energy systems, smart grids, sustainable mobility, circular use of materials, and digitalization, which I mentioned before. These kind of measures can have a relevant impact in terms of decarbonization, on CO2 emission reduction, more efficiency in the use of energy, carbon sinks, resource efficiency, and this generates social value linked to health and well-being, to accessibility, to social inclusion, to reduction in energy bills and contrast to energy poverty, to environmental awareness, to attractiveness of our places, to investments and job creation, and to risk reduction and resilience increase. These benefits can be evaluated from an economic point of view, and at Bocconi we are committed to this in order to demonstrate and show what is the value of sustainable urban regeneration. Looking at, in this case, at the Covenant of Mayors, a specific instrument at the European level, there are several instruments which city governments can use at this purpose. I just want to point how relevant can be awareness raising and energy management. So measures which are not the traditional standards and economic measures, but measures which actually involve active role of citizens and change of behaviors. Finally, to conclude, this is part of a wider research project we have at Bocconi University in Milan through our lab on sustainable urban regeneration, which is devoted to this kind of study. By the way, the picture is part of our Bocconi campus, is the new buildings of our business school, which is also an example of sustainable urban regeneration. And our lab is realized with the support of Heinz, Intesa San Paolo, Prelios, and Milano Sesto. And I anticipate here a next initiative from the lab, which is the launch of a massive online course. This has the purpose to contribute to education all over the world. It will be free, accessible free on the Coursera platform, and in this way, of course, it will be possible to have access to the contents generated by our lab and contribute to education and knowledge diffusion on this topic. I conclude my brief presentation, and I'm very glad to go back to the podium and leave the word to the next speaker. Thank you. The next speaker is Tadashi Matsumoto from the OECD. I suggest the speakers to go to the podium to use, there is the presentation, to use the slides.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Tadashi Matsumoto. Thank you, Edoardo, for inviting me to this important event. I would like to speak about how national urban policy can support urban regeneration from our previous work, and then also give a few ongoing work for inspiration, I hope. Let me start my slide here. I hope this is also shown well in online video streaming. I'd like to start with the urban opportunities. So this data has been produced by the Coalition for Urban Transitions. OECD has been supporting this activity in 2019, but it's still very relevant to start with this discussion. So cities have a strong potential to reduce CO2 emissions and then reach carbon neutrality. A few key numbers. So in the OECD region and cities, 60% of public investment and 40% of public expenditure are being made by subnational government. Also, we have a new study, showing that 63% of the climate significant public expenditure are coming from subnational government. 69% comes also of public investment also comes from local government in OECD average. But actually, when we are talking about public expenditure, it's really already subnational governments are playing a majority of roles. Second point here, I'd like to mention that 90% of the current urban emissions can be cut by 2050 without having a particular technology innovation, so meaning already available technical solutions, and also creating a lot of jobs. But this message is quite conditional, because what is important here is that this opportunity at the city level can be only materialized when city governments are working together with regional or national level government. So the hexagon shown here is that the city government only can, with city government only, only 30%, 28% actually of the current emission can be reduced. The 2/3 of the emission has to be reduced with a joint effort with other levels of government. With this opportunity we like to achieve, we also need to note that the capacity and the potential of reduction is very, very different across cities and regions. This graph is showing that the total production-based greenhouse gas emissions per capita, and then also the changes. Red dots, as you see, is actually the emission is increasing, and some green dots are showing that emissions are decreasing, but you already see that in the same country there are lots of disparities. And the size of the circle is showing the the emission per capita. So also you will see a big difference across across cities and regions at the same country, that the emission level is quite different. So that's why it's important that tailored policy making is necessary, is important. Tailored means that national government needs to take a place-based approach to different regions and cities. So we are advocating this through the role of national urban policies, meaning many countries have a national level urban policy frameworks, but first of all, not necessarily climate or carbon neutrality issues are part of the national urban policies. Second, if you have still, it's uniformly applied or uniformly addressed across cities, but not like a tailored approach across different sizes or different characteristics of cities. The report that we produced with the UN Habitat and Cities Alliance last year shows that 81% of national urban policies are addressing climate change. This is a good news. And then also 69% of NUPs are being reported to aim to contribute extensively or moderately to the goal 13. So these are really good news. But actually we need to have a close look, and again, if national urban policy is addressing place-based needs and challenges. Coming to the urban regeneration, we have several studies to understand what countries are doing. One particular example is coming from Korea, who is quite active at the national level to promote urban regeneration and working together with the local government. They created a special legal framework to promote and support urban regeneration. Every local municipalities are being asked to produce urban regeneration master plans, and accordingly national governments are providing supports to local governments. And then of course there are lots of urban level activities. I would like to focus 2-3 things here. So first one, the importance of integrated urban development. Integrated urban development. So of course, urban challenges are various, and then we really need, within a limited resource, we need to address the multiple objectives together. In this case, particularly, I'm focusing on the co-benefit between mitigation and adaptation. So not only carbon neutrality, but also, for example, investing in green corridors or greening streets or green roofs can alleviate the climate change impact, particularly the heat and then water related problems. Energy is another important issue. So this is from the ongoing study from the Netherlands. Netherlands is really trying to making a big effort in shifting away from natural gas to clean energies, and making 66 national governments is making 66 pilot projects at a neighborhood level to shift their energy source. Here it's very important that national government to note that national government is giving a choice actually to what type of measures you are choosing to shift their energy source. So one solution they are seeking for is a district heating. The other source is an individual solution like heat pumps and renovating their individual heating instruments. But again, there are differences across cities and regions in terms of the conditions. So that's why pilot projects are also giving a choice and the freedom for cities to think about what's the best solution for their cities. So that's an interesting, innovative initiative at the national level. So as you see another slide, pilot neighborhoods are quite important here. So not only just a top-down approach, but different neighborhoods are thinking about their own solutions, and then also linking it to local job creation, which is also another important piece. So to wrap up, actually, I would like to stress the territorial and place-based approach to urban regeneration, first of all. Second, the importance of national urban policy. Third, the importance of neighborhood and the local bottom-up approach. Here's a framework that OECD is advocating through the OECD principles on urban policy, in principle 7 out of the 11 principles, we have a specific item to promote enhanced urban regeneration, including through inclusive urban design. So if you're interested, please have a look at these urban policy principles and then also toolkits from OECD website. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Tadashi, also for reporting to us the relevant commitment of OECD on urban policy for climate, with these very interesting examples applied to urban regeneration. And now I leave the floor to Serine Shishaketotam from UN Habitat. UN Habitat is also fostering a very relevant program in these last years on urban regeneration, and Serine will present this process, which can be framed, of course, under the urban agenda. Please, Serine.
Thank you very much, and also for the invitation from Bocconi University as well as from cambiaMO. It was really lovely to be here, and a big thank you also to those distinguished speakers here at the side, and I'm really, really looking forward to that big picture from the data and the science that we've already heard of, and moving towards the different pilot interventions, and then also on the local scale, what cities have actually already been doing. So I really look forward to that, and I hope the audience as well. My name is Serine Karakdotam. I know everyone butchers that name, so that's why I'm just repeating it again. I'm the Program Management Officer for Climate Change at UN Habitat, and I'm delighted to be partnering Bocconi and cambiaMO. So today I'll talk a bit more about actually our flagship program. It's looking at inclusive and urban regeneration, and that can be, of course, a vehicle to many things, but inter alia it can be a vehicle for neutrality in cities. So it's just one of many approaches. Doesn't mean to be the set-in-stone solution or the cookie-cutter approach, but just to kind of inspirationalize us maybe what institutional measures can we take in our different organizations that can be cross-cutting, and so to move away from maybe one pilot interventions to a broader picture, to convincing all of you colleagues that this climate resilience really matter and that the climate crisis is real. So let me see how I can handle this. So yes. You've heard of already like multiple stats, of course, why cities matter. I'm just going into a few of them again. Of course, you've heard this week might be one of the most compelling weeks for urbanization. We have crossed the landmark of 8 billion people on the 15th of November in this world. Urbanization is one of the global megatrends. It is irreversible, it's unstoppable. That people move to cities is unstoppable. It must be noted that in cities, 75% globally, spatial inequality is higher than compared to in 2 decades ago. Almost 80% of our urban areas, residents do not have convenient access to public open space. We've noticed that very much during the COVID pandemic, where the need for open space was so critical, where the need of actually socially interacting with each other became in the open space as one of the solutions. As cities keep on expanding and growing rapidly, we must act to ensure that such growth is actually inclusive, it's vibrant, and it is sustainable for all. In this context, cities are also, of course, a crucial motor of change. So while we have the climate crisis and while we have those 75% of emission globally coming from cities, we also have cities as the hub of innovation, the hub of actually economic forces, the hub of social interactions. And there's also a lot of potential actually into steering against the 75% of global emission and reducing it. And as one of my speakers said before, actually with the innovation that we have at hand today, we can shift the needle and become net zero, or even maybe even one day positive cities by 2050, by 2060, whatever that target is, sooner rather than later would be great. But all of our efforts must be directed to resilient and sustainable cities. There are studies in place that say by 2030s, no, let me start again. Studies in place that say 75% of the infrastructure is yet to be built by 2030. So if that is true, and most of that infrastructure is to be built in Asia and Asia Pacific and the sub-Saharan region, then we must act now that all this infrastructure yet to be built is built inclusive, vibrant, resilient, and sustainable. So if we only act retrospectively, we lose that battle again. But for all of this, climate finance is needed, and I think we heard it many times in this COP, in many other COPs. None of the climate finance really breaks down on local level. A recent study has shown that about 79% of the climate finance goes to mitigation. That is great, but most of that goes to the global north. And big-scale mitigation measures in the global north are, of course, also great, as they are the greatest contributor to GHG emissions. But on the other side, if I have only 21% left for adaptation measures that are trying to win the race against climate vulnerability, and none of that goes to the local level, then we are missing out again. So any climate finance needs to go to a parity of adaptation and mitigation, and therefore needs to go also on city level, not only on national level, if at all. So in order to address that, one of the flagships from UN Habitat is actually looking at that social and environmental value creation as a fundamental principle. So that's flagship number one that I'm going to present a little bit more in context. It is a means to empower citizens in itself, improve quality of life for residents, enhance ownership of different interventions. So it looks very much as like this city from the bottom-up approach. It looks at improved resilience for neighborhoods and in better alignment between places and policies and the needs of people, as well as a stronger sense of belonging. These are all very buzzy words, I know. I will come to like more piloted examples to that to give it a bit more flesh. Another domain of change that we have is strengthening climate action, and they interact with each other. So there's like another of 5 domains of change that UN Habitat builds on. And in that domain of change 3, strengthening climate action, we look at the environmental value through nature-based solution. We look at how do we address mitigation and clean air in cities. How do we look at nature assets protection, as well as circularity, and last but not least, adaptation and resilience where it matters most for the ones that are most vulnerable to climate impacts. So these are all of our flagships. They are interacting with each other. They are cross-cutting. And the one for flagship number 1 is, as said, inclusive, vibrant neighborhoods and communities. So what that does that actually mean? It is actually built on a multi-stakeholder process. It convenes many actors that think alike to become in scale. Anything that we do in our institution is great that it is cross-cutting, and it's great that our projects are trying to achieve the different flagships. But on the other side, it's a drop in the ocean, so we can't do it alone. So that's why it is a cooperation of like stakeholders, like-minded, that want to bring in this regeneration aspects into cities for net zero, but also creating larger resilience. Therefore, that multi-stakeholder coalition is also there to give you technical assistance, but also find ways of resource mobilization to bring local finance where hopefully it matters. So through those technical cooperation agreements. Then within the flagship itself, there are a couple of value propositions that this stakeholder group has created to look at common principles and standards, policy, methodologies, tools, planning guidelines, and monitoring framework, so that we can actually assess what urban regeneration is. What does it mean if we put certain practices in place? How do we measure their success? What can we actually report by 2030 to say, yes, we have achieved or are in the progress to achieve net zero, net positive, or even adaptation and resilience? There is yet no common adaptation goal, and hopefully on the other side, our negotiators are negotiating for exactly that, to have a common adaptation goal. So before we know the language of that goal, if we have already some process or some measures in place that give a framework on how we can measure that or monitor urban regeneration, measure and monitor such pathways and their success, that is basically one of the value propositions that the flagship tries to do. Additionally, I think I mentioned actually already that it creates a global regional network of expertise, but that network of expertise drives also a certain dialogue into where do you actually need to invest, who needs to come on board, what investors need to come in to focus on urban regeneration. So it's strengthening the message in overall. I think I can skip that. It's a little bit of our collaboration framework, but I think that's not so exciting as actually the next slides when it comes to where we did we actually pilot. So I have 2 examples here, and again, this is just 2 examples of entire portfolio, of a portfolio of where urban regeneration is at the center, where urban regeneration becomes a vehicle for many other things, such as net zero or adaptation or resilience, or even pathways where you can say, where you can see there is an opportunity to not retrofit, but actually include digitalization means into the regeneration process itself from the start. So I'll start with one, and as we are so little, just a hands up. Anyone here from Latin America? Anyone traveled ever to Cancun? Very great. I can see a few hands up. Lovely. So that makes it a bit more tangible. So in Cancun, there has been equity park developed by community consultation, and it is a park where basically the DNA of it tries to bring a nature-based solution, but also what is the value proposition for residents. What do they actually need from the park and within the park? So it started to build a green and social infrastructure network of different infrastructure assets that were close to the park. It looked at aligning actually a corridor, a green corridor that then incorporated means of shading against urban heat island effect, but also just recreational space, whereas also it leads to the increase of value of land in the adjacent area, because it came with security and safety measures. It came with an open public space. It came with something that made the city or that area of the city more vibrant. Hoping that I'm not running out of time, I'm trying to be a bit faster. That's the community consultation process that's been throughout that area of the equity park. So to understand what do we actually need for women, what do we need for kids in that equity park, what do we need for people with disability, how does the design need to look like, where does the park need to become a sponge effect, and so on. So that again, the pilot in itself integrates therefore nature-based solutions in its landscape, in its aspects of different infrastructure components coming together. Another project, and that's actually a quite old project, if I can say, because it attracted many, many legacy projects to that, is the Nairobi River Life project. Anyone here from East Africa? Sasa?
Serine, we don't have much time, so
All
in
right.
this case you should make it
I'm making it
short.
short then. All right. So Nairobi is the word in Maasai. There is a Maasai word of like the land of water. But unfortunately, the aquifers in Nairobi are very much polluted. So the Nairobi River Life project started to clean up the entire water systems. And here are just a few of these pictures, how we did that. And it's based again on that value proposition that environment of river and arms to it really matters to the city itself. So it came with like economic benefits because it increased the land value. It came with innovation and creativity because it gave new space and public space for citizens. It increased health benefits because out of a sudden water quality improved and it was accessible for cleaning purpose and so on. Environmental benefits because there have been a reduction of like soil and water pollution, but also health-borne diseases is a means of climate adaptation. And then social benefits because out of a sudden you had public space not only to use but interact and mingle. And what I mean by the legacy project, through the river regeneration project or the river life project, it attracted many other side projects. For example, I'm skipping. Lithuni Avenue has been regenerated, which was adjacent to the river and became like a very vibrant street for citizens to interact with. So there's a lot to go for if we do it actually holistically and systemically and not pilot by pilot, and if we make sure that actually such frameworks in place are the identity of your organizations. So the way we work, it becomes institutionalized. So please join us. We're not alone, as said before. You have some of our partners. And also I invite you to join our ministerial meeting tomorrow. It's the first of its kind, where we bring urban ministers and urban development ministers to the COP table. It's at 10 o'clock in room MR20. And it's also the first time where non-constituencies, non-state actors can actually also intervene actively in the COP process. So be my guest and be there. I look forward to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for Serine for putting together this interesting wider framework of UN Habitat with some very interesting example. After your speech, I changed a little bit the schedule for coherence of the structure, and I asked Federica Ranghieri to intervene. Federica Ranghieri from the World Bank is now leading a very innovative project on climate development plan, which I think fits well with what we are saying now.
Thank you, Edoardo, and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me open the presentation. Hope you can see it. So as Edoardo was anticipating, I'm working for the World Bank. I'm the program leader for sustainable development here in Egypt. And I had fantastic opportunities in the past few months to work extensively with the government and and of course colleagues at the bank to develop what we call the Climate and Development Report. And I would like to discuss about this, which might seem not completely in line with the topic of the day, which is urban regeneration, just because one part of the analysis is clearly focusing on cities, and it's clearly focusing on building resilience and low carbon transitions in cities. And it was very clear that all this transformation process has to pass through regeneration. So it's just another way to look at urban regeneration through another document and through another set of development actions that, for example, the World Bank is putting together. But if I can use 30 seconds and use my past experience in South Asia, we also developed a big amount of resources, investments on urban regeneration in particular. So there's a series of projects I had the honor to work in, for example, one in Sri Lanka that really identified a lot of steps into urban regenerations as vital, for example, for flood protection and flood management. So there are a lot of very interesting intervention and implementation of urban regeneration activities that have extremely important impacts on urban resilience and urban disaster risk management. So I will try to go through my slides on the Egyptian experience quickly, and of course I will be open for any questions if needed. So this is a new core diagnostic that the World Bank put together and decided to launch this year. There are only 20 country climate change development reports done all over the world, and one is Egypt. There are 10 in Africa, of course, signaling how much is, this connection between climate and development is important and key in this region. And the rest, the additional half, is spread all over the world. This core diagnostic is trying to identify and show how climate and development are strictly connected, and they cannot be separated and cannot be treated in silos. These diagnostic reports based on data, obviously, rigorous research, and identifying what we call pathways to reduce climate vulnerabilities and mitigate greenhouse gases. They're done by a pool of experts, but they are always discussed and consulted, and if we're lucky, endorsed by the government. We were lucky here in, I would say here in Egypt, so this CCDR for Egypt has just been published and launched here at COP last week in the Egyptian pavilion. So what we do is the following. As you can imagine, we try to use the existing data, so we try to identify all the information that we can. So in this case, the CCDR is anchored on what Egypt already did. So we take into consideration development goals, ambitions, and the climate situation. We try to inform the discussion between climate change and development. I was telling Edoardo a few minutes ago that we had a great opportunity to really engage with line ministries. So ministries that were not necessarily exposed to climate change issues and now are absolutely conversant on all these type of activities. They know what an adaptation project, a mitigation project in their particular sector looks like, how it is important, why it is important for their own development goals. So that, to me, it's a great success. I hope they keep their ability to discuss climate change over and over and to incorporate and mainstream climate change in whatever actions they're doing. In the case of Egypt, there are three main pathways that are obviously very much expected, that are becoming absolutely key in enhancing resilience and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The first one is about the nexus between water, agriculture, and electricity. The second one is about a just and fair energy transition. And the third one, which is the topic of this session, is about resilient cities and coastal economies. So what we found, and I will talk about this one only, what we found in the report through a series of background analysis is that the annual economic benefits of transformative scenario for the 14 main cities are estimated at 433 times the financing need. So the main information is that whatever we spend to transform, to reduce greenhouse gases, to become more resilient, there is at least 4 times the opportunity to gain in the future. And that was a pretty good message that the government liked and acted upon. This scenario is also expected to reduce about 50 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And also, 2.5 billion cubic meters of water can be saved. Needless to say, water is the big elephant in the room in Egypt. And if you think that 97% of the water, the fresh water supply, comes from the Nile, you can also imagine that a drop of rain that changes the Nile intake of water will have an extremely high effect and impact on water supply. So what we saw in our analysis is that there are a lot of interesting aspects that may enhance vulnerability to climate change. So first of all, the population in Egypt is increasing at an incredible path. So 25 million in 1990, now 44 million in 2020 live in cities. There are some cities like Greater Cairo that are contributing almost half of the total GDP production in Egypt. Coastal governorates, especially on the Mediterranean side, they do contribute for almost 30% of GDP. So we're talking about really the engines of growth. Over the next 3 decades, there's additional urban population estimate almost to double. So we will have 40 million more people towards cities. This is clearly anticipating a set of impacts, vulnerabilities, exposure that are unprecedented and have not been planned for. Cities also lack infrastructures. There's a terrible lack of drainage, solid waste management, and a lot of high quality service delivery has to be perfected and updated. Also, cities are increasingly exposed to climate-related risks. So 4 out of 5 people in the main cities are exposed to one big climate risk. In some cases, it's even more than one. There's also sea level rising, especially on the northern coast, that is extremely worrisome. New analyses are predicting that 12 to 32% of the Nile Delta could be submerged by water from the sea, which of course increase the salinization, and of course it has important impact on agriculture and production of food. But this is really sort of the terrible challenges we are facing, like unfortunately many other cities in the world. What is that we could do about it? So this is a set of this is explaining actually the rest of the analysis. This is about the mean temperature and the pollution concentration. You can find everything in the report, so I will not spend too much time on this. This is about the pluvial flooding in Alexandria, so it's a set of analysis that we did to identify where the risks were and how they were changing over time. This one is about emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. The colleague that spoke right before me said that globally 75% of greenhouse gas emissions are from cities. In Egypt, it's more than 80%. So you will see that in some countries, even the emissions and economic growth are even more coupled. So there's no way to identify, or it's still pretty soon to identify a way to decouple growth, or economic growth and emissions. The last one is about sea level rise, and this is what I was telling about. There are projected exposure to sea level rising that are affecting the delta extremely sensibly. Up to 32% could be covered. Another point that I would like to make that is particular to Egypt, but I think can relate to many other cities, is that since cities are unplanned and unregulated in many cases, and spatial urban expansion is again unplanned and unregulated, this can have even an additional effect on the challenges that we're facing so far. So our study was trying to figure out what are the additional threat multiplier that we can face in Egypt cities and coastal cities. You can have in the slides a series of terrifying numbers and figures, and they are all about losing, the loss of land, arable land, and actually land in the cities to recreational purposes. The fact that there's also key constraints like land governance, absence of readjustment law and planning instruments that are actually not contributing to a reverse of these unplanned and unregulated expansions. I do believe that this is clearly linked to urban regeneration. I don't see how urban regeneration can be done effectively if there is absolutely no planning and no regulation on special urban expansion. So I would like to actually work on more on this aspect and identify where the linkages are and how we can contribute to these aspects. So let me get immediately, I know that the time is short, I don't want to take too much, over to almost to my conclusion. What we found there is that given the existing challenges, given that climate change is exacerbating those challenges, given also that the regulatory framework is not right now helping in supporting how we can reverse these tendencies, there must be some other levers that we can find. So actually some of these policy levers, some of these tools and investments that are given to the government and its agencies could play a very important role in reversing the situation, contributing to building resilience and reducing emissions. And some of these policy levers are indeed related to urban regeneration. People that spoke before me, my esteemed colleagues, were referring to, for example, nature-based solutions many times. And this is definitely one of the policy levers that we are trying to push, even here in Egypt, to reverse the situation. In particular for flood, heat, and coastal resilience. But in general, nature-based solutions are a very, very good option to explore. Other actions are related to green building, housing and energy efficiency. And a third point that it's very close to my heart, since that's the area I'm coming from, is about integrated and risk-informed planning for spatial development. So identifying all the information about vulnerability, exposure, identify how climate is actually exacerbating those vulnerabilities and exposures, and identify ways to respond. All pass through data, all pass through research, all pass through information that is collected, contained, and also provided to the users. And also you will see efficient use of resources, circular economy, and solid waste management. The last one, to me, is part of urban regeneration. So an effective solid waste management in areas where it's very much not performed is actually key to develop an effective urban regeneration again. Well, but here comes the difficult part. Where do we find the money? So this, the study was about 14 cities, as I said, which are the main cities in Egypt. And we were able to identify the amount of investments, roughly speaking, obviously, needed in order for these cities to transition to a low carbon and more resilient situation. To do that, we estimated that there was an amount that was extremely high, but that can be compared to the no action. So if we compare the needed 50 million it's 50 million tons of the mitigation that we need to reach, compared to, and how much it costs, compared to how much gains in averted losses and induced changes and innovation, the difference that we can find is that whatever dollar we are spending to reduce emissions and making these areas more resilient, 4.33 times it will be the multiplier to reach the averted losses that we can actually benefit from. So we were trying to push this argument to the government. I don't know if that will ever fly, but the overall idea is to really show that there's convenience in working on climate. There is great opportunities that are coming from climate again, and this is obviously the way we are proposing the government to move ahead strategically. So what is the strategic policy direction that we are proposing through this report? So cities need to pivot towards green, resilient, sustainable, and inclusive system for urban infrastructure and service delivery. They have an opportunity to do that. They have an opportunity to really change the growth trajectory. Government needs to deepen their effort in the SDG localization, integrate climate resilience and low carbon transition as key pillar. That's why, once again, the development and climate nexus is to be undertaken and taken together and mainstream. Adaptation is key priority, especially in coastal cities, but there's a need to coordinate between regional, local, and urban effort. Mainstream climate resilience and low carbon growth, it has to be included in urban planning, it has to be included in urban development strategies. Then strategic reform-oriented approach to green, resilient local and territorial development is key. And then there's last but not least, there's a tremendous need to leverage on private sector financing and develop innovative pooled fund-based models. There's some example in the book to raise climate and green finances for commercial and capital markets. And here are a list of the short-term actions that we're proposing. They are all through the three strategic pillars. One is about better information and risk management. The other one is about improved efficiency in resource use. And the other one is on how to enhance resilient infrastructure. All the actions that you see here, these are the short-term and these are the long-term. They have been all discussed intensively with the local governments, with the national governments, and we came out with this proposition as a concerted action. So let me conclude just saying that we do believe that building resilience in cities needs urban regeneration. That's the only way. And building also greenhouse gas transition, low carbon transition as well needs urban regeneration. So there's definitely a key policy focus that needs to be put on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federica. Let me only underline a couple of very interesting points in your wide relation, in your wide presentation. The first one is you emphasize the need to have a formal regulatory and planning framework in order to implement urban regeneration. This is, I think, an important point. And the second one is that the benefits outweigh the investment clearly in your analysis, and this is an incentive to act and act now. Now we are a bit late. We will take some extra minutes from our final deadline, but I ask the next speakers to stay in 7 minutes possibly, and I ask Benedetta Lucchitta to take the floor.
Good morning, everyone. I will try to stay in the 7 minutes, and with my presentation, I wanted to highlight which are the main contributions of urban regeneration to carbon neutrality, considering different sectors and different layers that are present in cities. So, considering the decarbonization pathways, building sector represent one of the priorities for cities. In fact, as highlighted in the data reported in the slide, building accounted for 31% of the world energy demand, 18% of electricity demand, and 31% of CO2 emissions. Urban regeneration can provide different opportunities for building retrofitting and so to decarbonize the building sector through different actions as represented in the graph, such as the optimization of operational efficiency of the building, the retrofit to optimize the asset efficiency. In this case, it must be taken into consideration also a little increase of CO2 given the embodied carbon of the new material that will be used to retrofit the building or other infrastructure. Other actions can be decarbonization of energy supplies, generate on-site green energy, as highlighted in the presentation of Mr. Matsumoto, and finally procure off-site green energy. Of course, considering that cities declare ambitious targets to 2030 or 2050 to reach carbon neutrality, different scales have to be taken into consideration, not just the building scale, but also district scale and city scale, in order to include actions that can generate positive impacts of different layers. For example, in the building scale, we have the building efficiency, the off-site generation of energy, and the storage also of energy produced. At district scale, we also can introduce impacts on sustainable mobility and the introduction of micro-smarts and microgrids. At city scales, instead, the last level of integration is the land use, the zoning, and the mix of function and services that can allow the decrease of CO2 emissions in different areas of the city. Urban regeneration can, the concept of urban regeneration allows to integrate all these components and also to introduce different actions and different measures, considering energy, the energy layer of cities, the built environment, the buildings, the transportation system of cities, and also the land use. The graph here is an example of the potential CO2 reduction through the implementation of different measures in the requalification of a neighborhood in Milano. Here in particular is highlighted the CO2 reduction through sustainable measure in the construction system, in the distribution of heating generation through renewable energy, sustainable mobility, the introduction and the potential of green system through nature-based solutions, and finally the expanded of district heating also in other parts of in the surrounding area of the neighborhood. Considering this first layer, the energy one, the positive energy district is an interesting concept, and it is based on the generation, on the on-site generation of energy and distribution of energy through the use of smart grids that helps also to integrate other services in the network. And finally, it's also based on the storage of the surplus of energy that can be produced in a specific district. This model is focused on, let's say, the main actor in this model is the municipality. Instead, the concept of energy communities introduced an innovative approach regarding the governance and the management of energy in cities. In fact, in energy communities, cities can play a leading role since they can finance the production of the energy they will use in their homes, in their neighborhoods. So in this case, the citizens became a prosumer, and in Europe there are quite energy communities are quite diffuse. Basically, I have two typologies of energy communities: citizens and renewable energy communities. Second layer is sustainable mobility. And also in this case, different measures can be implemented to decarbonize the transport sector in cities, such as the introduction of low traffic zones, as in the case of the superblock of Barcelona, in which the low traffic zones generated different positive impacts. For example, the increase of the 10% of pedestrian trips and 30% increase in the use of bike. Another interesting example is the Milano Sesto regeneration project. In Milano is one of the main urban regeneration projects in Europe, and also in this case the developer built the connection between the metro line, the metro stop of Milano Sesto, and the area in which the urban regeneration project will be implemented. Besides this, many other actions will be implemented, such as the development of the internal mobility to favorize the use of the bicycles, and also the inclusion of smart parking system and electric charging for vehicles. Third layer to be considered, it's the sustainable use of resources, and so using a circular approach in planning, in the implementation of new urban regeneration project in cities. In particular, here some examples of circular business model for the construction sector in order to optimize the use of resources. We have, for example, a circular supply model or resource recovery model, and so on. Here some data, some results for a project we carried out together with Arup and Genova University on the analysis of the potential impacts of circular action, of the implementation of circular action in different sectors: building sector, transport sector, and finally energy sector in 4 cities: in Bogota, in Glasgow, in Genova, and in Milano. And here you can see the results of the work focus on the city of Milano and on the building sector. Here we analyze different the possible impacts of different measures, such as the reduction in demand for new constructions, the reduction of use of material with high CO2 emissions, and the reduction also of virgin steel use by increasing the direct reuse of steel components. And here we measure that by implementing these actions, it is possible to decrease the consumption-based emission of the city of the 10%. Last layer is the green system of cities, the potential of the reinforcement of the green system of cities through the implementation of nature-based solutions. Serin and also Federica focus on this topic and stress the importance of the implementation of nature-based solutions, since these solutions can generate multiple benefits, not only on social and economic aspect, but also considering environmental ones, and specifically for mitigation and adaptation to climate change in city. Here, some data regarding the impact of nature-based solution in city, considering the capture and storage of CO2 emissions, but not only that, also impact in the decrease of temperature specifically during summer, and also the mitigation of the potential mitigation of flood events.
Excuse me, Benedetta, it's just 5 minutes left that we
I'm
have
concluding.
2 more
I'm concluding,
Thanks.
yes. And this was my last slide. And just to conclude with this presentation, I wanted to stress how urban regeneration can allow to consider at the same time different components and layers that have pivotal importance to reach carbon neutrality in cities, also taking into consideration different scales of actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Benedetta, also for showing the results or some interesting recent research on the dimension of urban regeneration in different fields and the contribution to the decarbonization. Now the floor to Paolo Bertoldi from the European Commission, which will show some innovative initiatives from the European Commission towards decarbonization. As we are late, I recommend Paolo also to compress his presentation.
Thank you, Edoardo, for the invitation. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to present you the latest assessment on energy and climate for cities in the European Union, with spillover also to other regions, of course. So I will start to present you a new initiative under the framework of Horizon Europe, the new framework program for research and innovation in the European Union, and is the mission for climate neutral and smart cities. So the objective of this mission is to have 100 climate neutral cities by 2030 in the European Union, and to ensure that these become a test bed to enable all the cities, and I'm stressing all the cities in the European Union, to become climate neutral by 2050, the year when the overall European Union should be climate neutral. This is set in law, in European law, as a mandatory target for all the European Union member states. So the cities have to do their part, and previous speakers have highlighted the large emissions deriving from cities, where citizens are living, where economy is mainly based. So the first round was to select these 100 cities, and there was an open call, 300 and more cities applied, and finally we arrived to selecting the cities, and these are on the slides. I know it's a busy slides, but you can go on the website of the mission and see the cities. They are spread out all around the European Union, and some 12 cities are also outside the European Union. So we have some support team, and in particular the mission platform, which give us a large financing to support cities to develop their plans to become climate neutral, provide advice on financing and technologies, basically looking also at the current R&I project founded by the European Union. The city has to sign a contract where they engage and commit to become climate neutral, and of course they can then have the label of a climate neutral cities at 2030. Of course, it's not easy. It's very, very challenging. And the GRC has put together an info kit for climate neutral cities, which are briefly described in a few minutes. So I guess it summarizes what was said, that is, need an integrated approach. You cannot take a single project, single building, but transportation, building, energy generation has to be combined. Second point, climate neutrality needs, of course, reduction as much as possible of greenhouse gas emissions, in particular scope 1 and scope 2, scope 3 for waste generation, but then some offsetting, either in the city or buying certified emission reductions needed. Otherwise, no city will reach climate neutrality. It's very difficult to bring all the scope 1, scope 2 emission and the part of scope 3 really to zero. But this is, we need accounting, and this is very important. So we don't want greenwashing, we want really to see that the city do their own best effort and then can be measured and monitored. Second point is to work on the sector that were already mentioned by Benedetta and other speakers, so I don't spend much time on this. It's important also to think about the circularity of economy. Renewables play an important role, as well as energy efficiency in all the sectors. Smart solution and digital solution is very important. So there is a way now to digitalize transportation, energy and building, to apply to citizens the right information to make their choice compatible with the climate neutral target. And of course, financing is very important. So cities have ambitious projects where they get financing, even the European Union is a problem even for large cities. So what are the innovative tools? Green bonds, private sector financing, ESG financing. So there are a lot of options that are looked upon in addition to grant and subsidy, for example, or loans from the European Investment Bank and other local or national development banks. So the initiative is up and running, and you can follow on the website. City will start to sign the climate contract in 2023, so means having plans how to reach climate neutrality. And this will be very interesting material to be analyzed by researchers and academia. And there are also, of course, the link with national policy. This has been already stressed by the previous speaker. It's very important that the cities are not isolated, are part of region and part of countries. So national policy will also help cities, both on the financing but also on the policy side. Few slides and few minutes to link to another important initiative, the Covenant of Mayors, which is part of the Global Covenant of Mayors, and there will be a lot of presentation in the EU pavilions tomorrow. And I will be speaking again about this one, showing the global result. Now I'm focused to Europe. And here we are moving from 100 cities to 10,000 cities, including a lot of small villages and cities all across Europe and also outside Europe. And we've done an assessment on how these cities have tackled their mission to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions at 2020 and 2030, and then looking at 2050. And not only mitigation, but also adaptation, which is the other very important dimension that cities face, again mentioned by previous speakers. And it's important to see that out of these 10,000 cities, only 331, sorry for the small numbers there, in red have committed to become climate neutral 2050, but this number is growing rapidly. And on average, these cities have committed also to reduce their emission 2030 by 40%. So not as much as the European Union, 55%, but it's again a good sign. On the next slide, you see that 7,000 cities have already an adopted action plan, covering more and more mitigation and adaptation. Many cities are reporting, and we are very important, not all the 10,000 cities, but almost approaching 3,000 cities have done a check where they are in their reduction of emissions and in the adaptation, and this is very important. That is a regular monitoring of emission and reporting. And because with this, we can then aggregate and come here back at COP and showing the real effort and success of cities in emission reductions. And I already mentioned the 40%, so I can skip this one. And we have now a database with almost 200,000 urban mitigation policies. in all the sectors: transportation, building, municipal facilities, waste, energy generation, and by type of policy. So regulatory instrument, information, infrastructure project, etc. And this is all open data that the researcher can investigate and analyze. And finally, let me spend a few words on risk and vulnerability. It's been added on recently to the Covenant of Mayor. When I talk recently, means in about 6-7 years ago, but cities are still having difficulty to plan. And so we asked them to assess the risk of vulnerability through an instrument that is called risk of vulnerability assessment, where they collect the type of hazard that the city is facing now and what about the future. Because we know a lot of this climate-induced hazard will increase in intensity and hit also the European and the Mediterranean area, has been already mentioned. And which sector are affected? Is it the infrastructure sector, the energy sectors, the building sectors? And we have a very interesting report that is summarized in this very busy graph. And we see more and more adaptation action in Europe, and the most reported hazard in the European Union, as reported by cities, extreme heat. Almost all Europe is hitting now more and more by high temperature in summer, combined by urban heat islands, so very hot in cities. Drought and water scarcity, been very, very important, for example, in northern Italy during last summer, and heavy precipitation and flooding and sea level rising. But also biodiversity is heat, as well as forest fires. And the most target sector for adaptation measures is indeed water, environment and biodiversity, greening, in particular through nature-based solution, and buildings, in particular where the elderly people or the low-income people is living that are facing the worst of this impact. Again, 15,000 policies, not as many as in mitigation, but this number is growing. And with this, I conclude my presentation, and everything is available on our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo, for showing the results of these innovative and clearly structured initiatives. And now I leave the floor to conduct the last part to Gianni Rondinella.
Yes, just we run out of time, but I want to present Ndivile, Mokoen, project coordinator of Gender CC Southern Africa. And Ndivile, is yours the floor.
Thank you, Gianni. Good afternoon, everyone. My input is based on the project that we ran in South Africa, looking at the climate change policies, assessing the gender perspective and social issues if they are integrated in those policies. The objective is to look at a bottom-up approach where we also talk to local communities, the very people who are impacted by climate change, who are at the cold face of climate change. What we're discussing today it's scientific and academic research, which is good to be able to tackle climate change in urban context. However, what we're missing is the local voice, the very people who are impacted by climate change, who feel the heat of climate change, people who die daily, who are displaced, who lose their livelihoods. Their voices are always left out when it comes to these decisions which are made for them. So the project was looking at assessing all the vulnerabilities at local level, linking them to the local climate policies. So as urbanization is proceeding rapidly, especially in coastal cities in developing countries, often outpacing government capacity to plan for sustainable growth. With growing urbanization, inequalities tend to increase. Urban populations are impacted by climate change as well as by the climate policies. Climate change impacts and responses affect people differently, depending on social factors like age, education, race, social status, gender, and capabilities. As a result, informal settlements are expanding into areas highly exposed to hazards along coastal lines or up steep hillsides. Unplanned growth further degrades the environment and makes already fragile ecosystems even less able to withstand climate shocks. In urban context, the impacts of climate change are unfolding in highly visible ways. In coastal cities, floods and landslides caused by storms and rising sea level are destroying infrastructure, displacing population, and weakening livelihoods. For these already living in poverty, these risks pose serious threats to their well-being. Despite the challenges posed by climate change and gender inequalities, evidence shows that women are actively contributing to building resilient cities. In urban context, women are carving paths to inclusion across multiple levels of local governance and helping communities become safer and more prepared to cope with disasters. Cities are important for climate policies and are a major contributor to the problem and are directly affected by climate change. They are increasingly acknowledged to play a major role in climate change responses. Hence, we need gender-responsive climate policy in cities. The climate change policies and measures are more effective if social factors are considered by better responding to different needs and capacities. Climate policy is fairer and more equitable in adverse impacts. If adverse impacts are avoided, that might aggravate gender inequality policies and can have many co-benefits if social and gender issues are considered. Why should cities actively tackle climate change with transformative gender approaches? It is to build resilience and sustainability. Cities are responsible for bulk of the greenhouse gas emissions, as alluded by the previous speakers. Therefore, mitigation action is crucial. The impacts of climate change are already felt in urban areas, and adaptation is unavoidable. Local government are closest to the citizen and to local communities to address climate change and related issues. Climate action can have many core benefits and will make a city more livable, sustainable, equitable, and inclusive if the approach is transformative, gender responsive, and addresses climate change with its intersecting issues. Some relevant field of actions that we looked at when we were assessing the policies, it was disaster risk reduction, urban planning, energy transport, demand and supply, water demand and supply, consumption and waste, and also green spaces, urban agriculture and forestry. So quickly just to mention some of the recommendations that we made to the cities, that cities' climate policies are to focus on transformational actions that address the root cause of vulnerability. Tracking changes in well-being and resilience, good governance is essential to absorb the climate shocks. Recognition of the disproportionate impacts of climate change on women and other marginalized groups, as well as the need to include women in informal climate-related decision-making processes. Designing community-based early warning systems, promote collaboration between formal and informal governance bodies, designing projects that are climate and gender responsive, and amplify the voices and action of women as agents of change. Also, accurate data collection disaggregated by sex and gender, and establishment of gender units and desks at municipal level. Urban and national policies should explicitly address the care work and the care economy and acknowledge indigenous and traditional knowledge, as it also plays an important role in this process. Considering gender-responsive budgeting and funding in order to enhance implementation. Monitoring and evaluation mechanisms to ensure institutional capacity and improved coordination. Stakeholder engagement and communication is also key to improve public interaction. Representation is essential in addressing and correcting structural gender inequalities and challenging male-dominated structural approaches and settings. Local councillors are to be empowered to deal with gender differentiated impacts, and the integrated development plan should be used as a tool to influence policy. In closing, it is well established that responding to climate-related risk in cities demand knowledge and capacity of local communities. Climate policies have the potential to create considerable improvement to the lives of those working and living in cities, and in particular women and girls. The policies have considerable potential to improve the livability of cities. For an example, to have better air quality, accessibility to services, health improvement, job creation, and more green spaces for creation. The last part, climate policies can also contribute to poverty alleviation and increase social and gender equality. Ultimate objective of that is to have a low carbon, climate resilient, equitable, gender just, and inclusive cities. Thank you so much. Sorry that I had to rush through my presentation.
Thank you, Ndivile. We apologize that the fact that this second part have to be in rush. So the last attendee is Aline Cardoso from the city of Sao Paulo, and I give you the floor, Aline. Sorry for that.
Presentation is not.
I think it's...
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. Well, I'll try to be as fast as I can. First of all, I'll tell you about São Paulo. São Paulo is, just for you to have an idea, the population of São Paulo is 12 million inhabitants. That's about 6 times Paris, just for you to understand how huge it is. It's a very rich city. The city alone stands for 10% of the country's GDP, and we have 5,000 cities in the country. So one city alone, 10% of the city's